handbag. That's right. Ancient Sumerians were more than familiar with handbags, or perhaps objects that modern people perceive as such.
There is an image that has been staring at humanity for 5,000 years, carved into stone monuments and pressed into clay tablets across multiple continents by civilizations that, according to every mainstream historical model, never once made contact with each other. A towering divine figure holding a small, perfectly rectangular bag, neat and almost casual at its side. Archaeologists saw it, labeled it decorative symbolism, and moved on with their careers intact. But when scientists finally subjected this image to rigorous cross-disciplinary analysis, measuring the geometry, mapping the global distribution, pressure testing the mythology against the physical evidence, what they found did not fit the decorative theory, did not fit any comfortable theory, and did not fit inside the boundaries of what we are supposed to believe about human history. Let us start with the basics, because the basics in this case are already more than strange enough to keep you up at night. The oldest confirmed depictions of the handbag appear in ancient Sumer, the civilization that emerged in what is now southern Iraq, around 5,000 years ago. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further, because this matters enormously for everything that follows. Sumer is not a fringe topic. It is not alternative history. It is not the kind of thing that gets discussed in conspiracy forums and nowhere else. Sumer is, by every mainstream academic measure, the cradle of human civilization. The Sumerians invented writing. They codified the first known legal systems. They developed organized agriculture, astronomical record-keeping, and architectural techniques that we are still working to fully understand. These were not primitive people scratching symbols into dirt. They were sophisticated, methodical, and deeply committed to recording the world around them accurately. And what they recorded obsessively was this bag. It appears on the Burney relief, one of the most famous surviving artifacts of ancient Mesopotamia, dated to around 1950 BCE. It appears on carved stone cylinder seals so small you need a magnifying glass to see the detail, and yet the bag is always there, always rendered with the same proportions, always held at the same height, always by the same type of figure. It appears on the stele of the vultures. It appears in relief carvings at the palace of Ashurnal I, carved around 850 BCE. 1,000 years after the earliest known depictions, 1,000 years, and the image had not changed. Not the shape, not the way it was held, not the context, nothing. Now, here is the first thing that should bother you. In human artistic tradition, symbols evolve. The cross looks different in the 4th century than it does in the 14th. The depictions of gods change as cultures shift and merge and collapse and rebuild. Artistic conventions are fluid. They mutate with time, with contact with other cultures, with changing religious emphasis. That is just what human art does. But the handbag does not mutate. For 3,000 years across Mesopotamian civilization, the image remains essentially identical. Same proportions, same handle arcing over the top, same small rectangular body, same manner of being carried at hip height, arms slightly bent. The consistency is not the kind of consistency you get with a decorative flourish. It is the kind of consistency you get when you are depicting something real, something specific, something that people recognized and needed to be depicted accurately. That consistency alone should have triggered serious academic investigation decades ago. For the most part, it did not. And we will get to why that is in a moment, because the reason is both understandable and frankly a little embarrassing for the field. But first, we need to talk about who is holding the bag, because that is where this story gets genuinely complicated. The figures depicted carrying the handbag in Sumerian art are not ordinary humans. That much is clear from the carvings themselves. They are consistently shown as larger than the human figures around them. They wear horned helmets or crowns, a universal symbol in Mesopotamian iconography for divine status. They are frequently depicted with wings, and they are shown performing specific repeated actions, carrying pine cones, touching or fertilizing sacred trees, flanking kings or temple entrances, and always holding the bag. These figures have names in the Sumerian text, the Abkalu, sometimes translated as the Seven Sages, sometimes as the Watchers. Sometimes in later Ardean tradition, connected directly to the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens and were credited in Sumerian mythology with giving humanity civilization itself, agriculture, writing, mathematics, architecture. According to the text, these were not inventions that humans developed gradually. They were gifts handed down by beings who arrived with knowledge already intact. You can dismiss this as mythology, and most mainstream scholars do. That is a reasonable position because mythology is not the same as history. Ancient societies often created divine stories to explain where their knowledge and achievements came from. But here is where the mystery gets more interesting. Sumerian texts describe the Apkallu in surprisingly specific terms. They are given individual names, roles, areas of expertise, and connections to particular kings and cities. They are not simply vague spiritual beings. In these stories, they interact with the physical world, teach humanity, travel between cities, and carry objects connected to something called the Me. In Sumerian mythology, the Me represented divine powers, laws, or properties associated with civilization. They included things such as kingship, priesthood, writing, music, warfare, and craftsmanship. One famous story tells of Inanna taking the Me from the god Enki and bringing them to Uruk. Whether these were imagined as literal objects or symbolic representations is debated, but the important point is that ancient texts repeatedly connected civilization itself with objects that could be possessed, transferred, and carried. That makes the mysterious handbag more intriguing. I am not suggesting the Sumerians literally believed a god-packed civilization into a modern-style handbag. That would go far beyond the evidence. But when the artwork, mythology, and repeated imagery are examined together, the symbol becomes harder to dismiss as meaningless decoration. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists and art historians simply treated the handbag as part of the religious imagery. Later researchers began asking different questions. Instead of only asking what the symbol represented, they asked what the object actually looked like. How consistent were its proportions? How was it held? Did artists across different periods depict the same basic form? When hundreds of Mesopotamian depictions are compared, the same general features repeatedly appear: a compact rectangular body, a curved handle, and a consistent way of carrying it near the figure's side. The shape remains remarkably recognizable across centuries. That does not prove the object was technological, extraterrestrial, or even a literal bag. But it does suggest that the symbol had a specific meaning within the cultures that repeatedly used it. And then the mystery becomes even bigger, because almost identical handbag-like objects appear in ancient artwork far beyond Mesopotamia. If completely separate cultures were creating similar imagery without direct contact, was the resemblance simply coincidence, a shared symbolic idea, or evidence of some deeper cultural connection? That is the question that turns the ancient handbag from an interesting artistic motif into one of archaeology's strangest visual mysteries, the kind of proportions you would expect to remain consistent when an object had a specific purpose. If the handbag were purely a religious symbol, its design should have changed over centuries, just like other ancient symbols. Yet the basic shape appears remarkably consistent, almost as if artists were following a precise visual tradition. Then researchers compared the Mesopotamian handbag with similar objects found in ancient Mesoamerican artwork. The resemblance is striking. Similar proportions, similar curved handles, and similar positioning beside divine or ritual figures. The problem is that there is no accepted evidence showing direct contact between these civilizations. The mystery becomes even deeper at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. Dating back to around 9000 BCE, the site is thousands of years older than Sumerian civilization. Some carvings have been interpreted by alternative researchers as resembling the same handbag-like form, although mainstream archaeologists do not generally accept that interpretation. Similar objects have also been proposed in the artwork of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, including imagery associated with the Gateway of the Sun, and in ancient South Asian religious art. Each example can be explained individually as symbolism or coincidence. But when similar shapes appear across distant cultures and enormous spans of time, the bigger question becomes difficult to ignore. Were these cultures independently creating the same symbolic image, or could they have inherited the idea from an older source that has not yet been identified? And this is where the lost civilization theory enters the discussion. The idea of an advanced civilization predating known history has often been mixed with pseudoscience and unsupported claims, which is why archaeologists approach it with extreme caution. But separating the speculation from the evidence leaves us with a legitimate mystery. Why does this strange handbag-like symbol appear so repeatedly in ancient art, and what did the people who created it believe they were actually depicting? The researchers who examined the handbag motif are not simply fringe commentators making wild claims. Their work has been presented through academic and comparative research, and their conclusions have generally been cautious. Their basic argument is that the documented evidence does not easily fit the idea of completely independent development. The consistency in the object's proportions, combined with its appearance across widely separated regions, demands an explanation that mainstream archaeology has not fully settled. That is a remarkably careful way of presenting a potentially explosive idea. Academic researchers often use this kind of restrained language when the evidence raises questions that could challenge established assumptions. There has also been resistance to taking the handbag question seriously. Some researchers interested in comparing Mesopotamian and Mesoamerican examples have reportedly struggled to gain support for further investigation. Others have been warned that cross-cultural comparisons require extraordinary evidence before they can be taken seriously. And that creates an interesting problem. What exactly counts as extraordinary evidence when the conventional explanation may not account for every detail? If the same unusual shape keeps appearing, if the proportions remain surprisingly consistent, and if those measurements can be documented and compared, then the question cannot simply be dismissed because the conclusion is uncomfortable. Because if the handbag really does represent a specific object, rather than a generic religious symbol, then researchers would have to reconsider some assumptions about how certain symbols and technologies moved through ancient cultures. That does not automatically prove a lost civilization or ancient global contact. But it would force historians to investigate possibilities that are currently considered unlikely. And changing a long-established historical framework is never easy. Academic careers, textbooks, museum interpretations, and entire theories of cultural development are built around existing timelines. Asking scholars to completely rethink those assumptions is not like asking someone to change their mind about a minor detail. It is more like asking them to reconsider the foundation of the house they have spent decades building. But now comes the more fascinating question. What was actually inside the bag? The analysis did not only focus on where the symbol appeared or how consistently it was drawn. Researchers also examined the physical appearance of the object and asked what its shape might tell us about its possible contents and function. The simplest explanation is that the handbag represents a ritual water container, possibly a bucket used during purification ceremonies. This interpretation has some genuine archaeological support. Similar containers appear in ancient ritual contexts, and the pine cone-like objects carried by the Apkallu figures are often interpreted as tools used for sprinkling or purification. At first, that explanation seems reasonable, but supporters of the alternative interpretation point to several problems. In some detailed carvings, the proportions of the handbag do not resemble typical liquid containers. Its walls appear relatively thin, while the curved handle does not always look practical for carrying a heavy volume of water. Functional liquid containers tend to develop shapes that account for weight, balance, and movement. You can see this across ancient Egyptian, Roman, and Mesopotamian vessels. Their designs vary, but the physical demands of carrying liquid influence their construction. The handbag does not always appear to follow those same principles. Instead, its shape looks more like a compact container designed to hold something solid that remains relatively stable inside. That does not prove it contained a technological device, but it does raise another possibility. The second theory is that the object may have represented some kind of instrument, measuring device, or specialized tool. Perhaps something connected to calculation, record-keeping, navigation, or ritual measurement. This idea becomes more interesting when we examine some of the detailed Assyrian reliefs from the 9th and 8th centuries B.C.E. In several of these carvings, the Apkallu figure carries the familiar bag in one hand while holding another unusual object with the other. Scholars have interpreted this object in different ways. Some identify it as a pine cone. Others suggest it could be a flower or another ritual item. A much more controversial interpretation claims that it resembles a small device attached around the wrist. That idea has never become an accepted archaeological conclusion, and it should be treated cautiously. But when you look closely at the highest resolution carvings, the object does have a surprisingly structured appearance. It seems to contain a circular portion along with what looks like a band or attachment around the wrist. And that is where the ancient handbag mystery becomes even stranger. Because if the object in the hand was simply a ritual symbol, and the object on the wrist was another ritual symbol, then the entire scene makes sense within Mesopotamian religious art. But if even one of those objects represented an actual tool, measurement instrument, or device, then we may be looking at something much more specific than decorative mythology. The question is no longer simply, why did the ancient artists draw the bag? The bigger question becomes, what were they trying to show us? It sits almost exactly where a modern wristwatch would sit. Now, I am not claiming these ancient figures were literally wearing watches. That would be an enormous leap beyond the evidence. What I am saying is that the object is unusual enough that multiple researchers, working independently, noticed the resemblance and questioned what they were actually looking at. The fact that the same strange detail keeps appearing in discussions makes it worth examining, even if the interpretation remains controversial. The third and most radical theory connects the mysterious handbag directly to the Me of Sumerian mythology. If the Me were more than abstract divine powers, and instead represented some form of stored knowledge or information, then the handbag could theoretically be the container used to carry them. To people thousands of years ago without concepts like computers or data storage, an advanced device might simply have been described as a sacred container carried by a divine being. The idea is controversial, but ancient objects and descriptions are often difficult to interpret through a modern perspective. Some researchers have compared the Ark of the Covenant with electrical technology, while others have connected the Vimanas of Indian traditions with aircraft. None of these theories are proven, but they show why mysterious ancient objects continue to attract attention. So where does that leave us? The handbag-like motif appears across widely separated ancient cultures, including Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. The figures carrying these objects are often connected with gods, sacred knowledge, or the transmission of civilization. Mainstream archaeology generally explains these similarities through local symbolism and independent development, while alternative researchers argue that the repeated patterns deserve deeper investigation. If independent development cannot fully explain the similarities, two possibilities remain. The first is ancient contact, perhaps forgotten trade, migration, or navigation networks carried the symbol between distant civilizations. The second is even more mysterious, a common ancient source, an older culture whose traditions survived long after the civilization itself disappeared. And this is where Göbekli Tepe becomes important. Built thousands of years before Sumer, it contains enormous stone pillars and complex carvings created by people whose society we still understand only partially. If some of its imagery truly connects to the later handbag tradition, it could suggest that certain symbols survived across thousands of years. But one thing must remain clear: similar appearance does not prove cultural connection. A container with a curved handle could have been invented independently. The real question is whether the similarities extend beyond shape into proportion, symbolism, context. We still do not know who built Göbekli Tepe, what language they spoke, or why they deliberately buried the site. But if the handbag-like symbol really appears there thousands of years before Sumer, the mystery becomes much harder to dismiss. Whatever the object represented, someone considered it important enough to preserve its image in stone. The Sumerians were also clear that the Me were connected with the foundations of civilization and associated them with divine beings who brought knowledge to humanity. Maybe this was mythology, maybe it was symbolic, or maybe the story preserved a memory of something much older. The image is real, the carvings are real, the recurring motif is real. What remains uncertain is what the ancient artists believed they were showing us, and that leaves us with one haunting question. If civilizations across thousands of years kept showing us the same mysterious bag, what exactly were they trying to make sure we never forgot?